The morning Mabel Gentry arrived in Cimarron, Oklahoma territory. The dust was so thick she could taste the future on her tongue, and she had exactly 47 cents and a dead father's dream folded inside her coat pocket. She stepped off the stagecoach with her chin lifted and her carpetbag clutched against her side, surveying the raw town that had sprouted up like a weed from the red clay earth. Cimarron in the spring of 1893 was not a pretty place by any measure that polite society might recognize. It was all noise and ambition, hammers striking green lumber at dawn, men shouting prices across the unpaved main street, mules braying at nothing in particular. The Cherokee Outlet land run was only weeks away, and every soul with two legs and a prayer had descended upon the territory's edge towns, hoping to claim a piece of the greatest land opening the United States government had ever staged. Over 11 million acres would be thrown open to settlement, and whoever got there first, or whoever won the lottery that the government had newly instituted for some parcels, would plant their stake and call it home. Mabel was 24 years old, the daughter of a Missouri wheat farmer who had died of pneumonia the previous December, leaving her the deed to nothing and the memory of everything. Her mother had passed when Mabel was 12, and she had spent the intervening years keeping the farm alive beside her father, learning the soil the way other young women learned needlework. She was not a fragile creature. She stood 5 feet 6 inches with sun-browned skin and dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. Her eyes were a gray-green that shifted with her moods, like a sky that could not quite decide on weather. She had come here because her father used to speak of Oklahoma the way some men spoke of heaven. Rich land, he had said, black soil that would grow anything you planted in it. Before he died, he had made her promise to try for it. So she had sold what little remained on the Missouri farm, packed what she could carry, and made her way south and west through a chain of crowded rail cars and swaying stagecoaches, until she arrived at this improbable town on the edge of something enormous. The first thing she needed to do was find the land lottery registration office. The second thing she needed was a meal. She had not eaten since the dry biscuit she had choked down at the last relay station somewhere before noon. She asked a woman sweeping a boardwalk where the territorial land office might be, and the woman pointed her 2 streets east and told her not to lose her registration number if she got one, because there were men in this town who would steal it right out of your hand. Mabel thanked her and headed that direction. The land office turned out to be a temporary wooden building, barely more than a large shed, with a long line of people snaking from its door and around the corner of the adjacent livery stable. She joined the back of the line and settled in to wait, shifting her carpetbag from one hand to the other. That was where she first saw Gideon Blackwell. He was standing roughly 15 people ahead of her in the line, and he was hard to miss. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair curling slightly at his collar beneath a battered tan hat that had seen enough sun to have its own history. He wore a worn canvas duster over a blue flannel shirt, and his boots, though dusty, were good quality leather, the kind that did not come cheap. He was speaking with the man ahead of him in line, laughing at something, and even at a distance Mabel could see the easy warmth in him, the way people leaned toward him naturally, the way flowers lean toward light. She was not particularly interested in any man that morning. She was interested in land. The line moved slowly, and the sun climbed higher and pressed down on the waiting crowd. Mabel listened to conversations drift past her, people comparing notes on parcels, warning each other about certain townships that had rocky subsoil, debating which sections near water would go first. She absorbed everything, filing it away. About 40 minutes into her wait, she became aware of a commotion near the front of the line. She stretched up on her toes to see. A woman near the office door was in some distress. She could tell that much. The woman was perhaps 50, heavyset, with a plain gray dress and a face that was red from the heat and from whatever trouble had found her. A man beside her, who appeared to be a clerk of some sort, was gesturing apologetically. The woman's voice carried back through the crowd in fragments. Something about a form, something about her husband's name, something about being turned away. Mabel understood it within another moment. The territorial land regulations for the lottery, written with the gracious thoughtfulness that government offices typically applied to women, required that female applicants either be the head of household, a widow, or a single woman of legal age filing under their own name. The woman at the front of the line had apparently been expecting to enter jointly under her husband's name and had not understood that the rules required separate registration. Her husband had already registered and taken his numbered slip. She could not be added to his entry. She needed her own slip and her own number, but there were only so many slots allocated for the lottery drawing in each district, and this particular registration window was nearing its capacity. The woman was crying now, quietly and with great dignity, dabbing at her face with the corner of her apron. Mabel watched the crowd. Most people looked away. Some looked uncomfortable. A few looked relieved, in the way people feel relieved when someone else's misfortune is not their own. Then the tall man in the tan hat did something that made Mabel stop breathing for a moment. He stepped out of his place in the line, walked to the front, spoke briefly with the clerk, and then turned and offered his numbered slip to the weeping woman. Mabel was close enough now that she could hear his voice, a low, unhurried baritone with the faint trace of a Texas drawl. "Ma'am, I want you to take this. I registered yesterday under the early window, so I have this preliminary slip, but I haven't confirmed my parcel preference yet. The rules say I can transfer an unconfirmed preliminary slip to another applicant before the window closes. Take this and go back in and confirm whatever parcel you need." The woman looked at him as though he might be an apparition. "I cannot take your place, young man. You have been waiting in this line. I'll get into another lottery or try the run directly," he said, with a tone that suggested it was no great matter, though Mabel suspected it was. "Please take it." The woman took it, still weeping, now from gratitude instead of frustration. She clasped his hand in both of hers and thanked him repeatedly. Then she turned and went back inside. The tall man in the tan hat walked back toward his place in line, and several of the men ahead of him waved him back to his original spot as a silent acknowledgment of what he had done. He accepted this with a modest nod and settled back in. Mabel watched him for another moment, then shifted her carpetbag and looked ahead at the line. She had a good memory for faces. She reached the front of the line 40 minutes later. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a harried expression, slid a form across the desk to her. Name, Mabel Gentry. Age, 24. Status, head of household, widow or single female. Single female. He looked up at her briefly, as clerks do when they are surprised by someone who does not fit the category they assumed, then looked back down at his ledger. Parcels available for the lottery drawing are listed on the board behind you. You can indicate a first and second preference for your numbered slip. If your number is drawn, you'll be notified at the posting board outside by the end of the week. Mabel turned and studied the board. It was a large, chalk-written list of parcel numbers with brief notations beside each one. She had done her research on the train, reading every pamphlet and newspaper article she could find about the Cherokee outlet. She knew what she was looking for. Land near water, not too rocky, with enough elevation to avoid the worst flooding, in a township that had not already been overrun by speculators who would make the surrounding land hostile to small homesteaders. Her eyes landed on one entry near the middle of the board, Parcel 7 of Township 14, Range 8. It had a notation beside it in small chalk letters, Creek Access, East Elevation, Black Loam reported. It was, by every measure she had identified in her research, the finest available parcel in this district. She gave that as her first preference and a backup parcel near the same township as her second. The clerk handed her a numbered slip. She looked at it. Number 31. She tucked it carefully inside her coat pocket, next to her father's folded dream. She walked out of the land office into the bright afternoon and nearly walked directly into the broad chest of the tall man in the tan hat, who was apparently done with his own secondary business inside the office and exiting at the same moment. He caught her by the arm to steady her, stepping back with an automatic "beg your pardon, ma'am," and then looked down at her with dark eyes that were an unexpected deep brown, the color of good saddle leather. "No harm done," she said, adjusting her hat. "You were in the line," he said, with the mildly pleasant tone of someone making an observation rather than a conversation. "So were you," she replied. He smiled at that. It was a good smile, unhurried and genuine, reaching all the way to those dark eyes. "Gideon Blackwell," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mabel Gentry," she said. "You come in from far. Missouri. You? Texas, originally. Been working cattle up and down the territory for the last 3 years. Thought it was time to stop moving and put roots somewhere." He said it simply, without self-pity, but she caught something underneath the words, a kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with distance traveled. "That was a generous thing you did," she said, "for that woman in line." He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way honest people do when their kindness is acknowledged. "She needed it more than I did. You lost your lottery spot. I'll try the run directly, or there are other drawings. I got to look at the board before I gave up the slip. I had my eye on a particular parcel, but there are ways to reach it." He said this evenly, as if convincing himself as much as her. "Which parcel?" she asked, curious in a way she could not fully explain. He paused for just a moment. "7 of Township 14, Range 8, Creek Access, good soil. I looked it up in the territorial survey before I came down here." He shook his head slightly. "But these things have a way of working out." Mabel felt a peculiar sensation move through her, something like cold water finding a crack in stone. She had just given that same parcel as her first preference. She was holding lottery number 31, and his preferred parcel was the one she had asked for. She did not tell him that. She did not know why she did not tell him, except that the moment had already passed and something about saying it felt too strange. "Well," she said, "I hope you find what you are looking for, Mr. Blackwell." "Same to you, Miss Gentry," he said, touching his hat again. "You staying in town for the week?" "I'll need to be. The posting is at the end of the week." "The Cottonwood boarding house on Larimer Street takes women boarders. Mrs. Parcel runs it. Good food, and she doesn't gouge on the price." "Thank you," Mabel said. She meant it. They went their separate ways into the busy Cimarron afternoon, and Mabel found the Cottonwood boarding house without trouble, and Mrs. Parcel, who was a stout woman in her 60s with a voice like a friendly thunderclap, showed her a small, clean room at the end of the hall and charged her a fair price per week. Mabel set her carpetbag on the narrow bed and sat down beside it and looked out the window at the red clay street and the raw wooden buildings and the endless tide of people flowing past. And she thought about the parcel with creek access and black loam and east elevation. And she thought about the man who had given up his lottery slip for a stranger and was now going to try to reach that same parcel by other means. She thought about the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Then she told herself firmly that she had not come to Oklahoma for any man, and she went downstairs to see about supper. She met him again the following morning entirely by accident, or perhaps by the logic of small towns, which have their own way of throwing people together repeatedly until the universe makes its point. She was at the General Mercantile on the main street, trying to price out how far her remaining money could stretch toward supplies for settling a piece of land she did not yet have. She was studying the cost of a small cast-iron pot when Gideon Blackwell appeared beside her, apparently engaged in a similar exercise with a coil of rope. "The Hanson Brothers store at the south end of town undercuts this place by about 12%, he said, without preamble. She looked at him. He was not looking at her, still examining the rope with professional attention. "Do they have cast iron?" she asked. "I believe so, and they have a better selection of seed stock if that's what you're planning." "It is what I'm planning." She set the pot down. "How do you know so much about this town? You said you came from Texas." "I've been through Cimarron twice before. Cattle drives. I make it a habit to know where the useful stores are in any town I might come through again." He coiled the rope back on its hook with an easy competence. "I'm headed there now if you want to walk over together. 4 eyes are better than 2 for making sure a storekeeper is giving you honest measure." She considered this for exactly 1 second. All right. They walked to the Hanson Brothers store, and he had been right about the prices. He helped her identify a solid cast-iron pot, a good sharp skinning knife, and a bag of mixed seed that the proprietor, a cheerful Norwegian named Lars Hansen, swore by. She helped Gideon negotiate a better price on a length of quality rope and a set of fence staples he wanted, drawing on a memory of her father's purchasing habits that she had not known she retained. "You're a natural at this," Gideon said as they came out into the street. "My father was a farmer. He raised me to understand the difference between a fair price and a robbery. Good man." "He was," she said. The past tense arrived quietly and Gideon heard it. "I'm sorry," he said. "Last winter," she said. "He always wanted to come out here, so I'm coming for him too." Gideon was quiet for a moment and then he said, "That's a good reason, better than some I've heard." "What's yours?" He was quiet for a longer moment this time, and she thought he might not answer. They walked half a block before he spoke. "My father had a ranch in Texas. Good land, decent size. He ran cattle on it for 20 years. When he died 6 years ago, it passed to my older brother, which is how it should go. I don't have any quarrel with that. But it meant I was a hand on land that used to be partly home, and then eventually I wasn't even that anymore when my brother needed to cut costs. I've been riding and working for other men ever since. I want something that's mine, something nobody can take from me because it belongs to somebody else more." He said it without bitterness, but with a weight that she recognized, the weight of a person who has spent years carrying a reasonable and quiet grief. "That's a better reason than most," she said. He looked at her sideways and the corner of his mouth lifted. "Now we're even." They had lunch at a small Mexican establishment run by a woman named Senora Castillo, who served them beans and tortillas and a peppery stew that was the best thing Mabel had eaten in at least 3 weeks. Gideon paid for his own and she paid for hers, which she appreciated without needing to say so. Over the meal, they talked about farming methods and cattle management, and the technical challenges of building a homestead from raw prairie. And somewhere in the middle of a discussion about whether shallow wells or driven wells were more reliable in this part of the territory, Mabel realized she was genuinely enjoying herself. She was also noticing things she had not paid attention to the previous day. The way Gideon listened when she spoke, with his full attention, not looking away or past her or waiting for her to stop talking so he could say his next thing. The way he held his opinions firmly but without arrogance, and changed them without embarrassment when she made a good point. The fact that he had calluses on his hands that told an accurate story about who he was. The fact that he was 28 years old, he mentioned it in passing when they talked about his father's death, and had the settled manner of a person who had been tested by life but not broken by it. She walked back to the boarding house in the late afternoon and did not think about him anymore. She thought about him considerably. The week passed in a particular pattern that she would later think of as the most ordinary and extraordinary days of her life. Each morning she found some reason to be doing something practical, visiting the land records office to study plat maps, walking the edge of town to observe the steady stream of settlers coming in, attending the evening meetings at the courthouse where territorial officials explained the lottery process to anxious crowds. And each day she encountered Gideon Blackwell, sometimes by arrangement, sometimes by the sheer gravitational pull of 2 people in a small town who are drawn toward the same spaces. He was working that week as a temporary hand at a nearby livery, caring for the overflow of horses that the swollen population of Cimarron had brought with it. It was honest work, and he was good at it. She saw him there twice when she was passing, and both times he looked up from whatever he was doing with that particular attentiveness that she was coming to recognize as his version of a greeting. On the 3rd day, They rode out together to look at the land. It was his suggestion, practical and carefully worded, that since both of them were trying to plan for settlement, and since horses could cover more ground than feet, would she like to borrow one of the livery horses at the reduced rate he could arrange and ride out toward the parcels they were considering? She agreed, and they spent the whole of a long, golden afternoon riding through the Oklahoma grassland that was just beginning to green up with spring. The landscape undid something in her that she had been keeping carefully knotted. It was enormous and beautiful in a way she had not anticipated, the tall grass bending in long waves under a wind that smelled of sage and red earth, the sky a blue so saturated it seemed painted. Hawks circled in the thermals above a shallow creek that wound through the low ground. She could see, in the particular way that farmers see land, what this place could become. She could see fields here and kitchen gardens there, and a house with its back to the north wind. Gideon rode beside her without talking much, which she appreciated. He was a man who understood that some things did not require commentary. When they reached the general area of Township 14, Range 8, he pulled his horse up on a rise and looked out over the creek bottom below them. The creek was maybe 20 feet wide at this point, moving clear over smooth stones, edged with cottonwood trees that were just beginning to leaf out. The land rising from the creek on the eastern side was a gentle slope of dark soil, exactly the kind of black loam the chalk notation on the board had promised. "There it is," he said quietly. She looked at it beside him and could not speak for a moment. "It's everything you'd want," she said finally. "It is," he agreed. He was quiet again, and then he said, "I'm going to ride the run, I think. If I can get a good horse under me and a clear start, I might be able to reach it before anyone else. A man on horseback with the right animal can cover 12 miles in the time it takes most people to cover 6. "That's risky," she said. "Most things worth having are." She looked at the creek, at the cottonwoods, at the dark soil rising away from the water, and thought about lottery number 31 in her coat pocket and the secret she had been carrying for 5 days. She knew she should tell him. She had no good reason not to tell him. They had spent the better part of a week becoming something that was not quite friendship and not quite anything else either, something warmer than acquaintance and more careful than the word she was not yet ready to use. "Gideon," she said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the creek. His profile in the late afternoon light was all clean lines and quiet strength, and she felt a sudden rush of something that made her chest ache, a tenderness she had not asked for and could not quite put down. "I put that parcel down as my first preference," she said, "for the lottery." He turned and looked at her. His expression did not change immediately. It processed the way expressions do when a person is absorbing information that rearranges something fundamental. "Parcel 7, he said. "Parcel 7 of Township 14, Range 8, she confirmed. He looked back at the creek. A hawk cried somewhere above them, a long descending note. "You've had number 31 this whole week," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. There was something moving across his face that she could not quite read, and she braced herself for some version of resentment or frustration. Instead he said, "Well, I hope your number comes up." She blinked. "Truly." He looked at her with an expression that was honest to the bone. "You came out here on your father's dream and your own determination, and you have nothing to fall back on if it doesn't work out. Me, I have skills that can earn wages. I have options you don't. If one of us wins that parcel in the lottery, it ought to be you." He paused. "Though I'll admit I am going to ride hard on the run if your number isn't drawn." She felt the ache in her chest intensify to something almost painful. "You are a very strange man, Gideon Blackwell." "So I've been told," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted. They rode back to Cimarron in the long dusk, and the grass turned gold around them, and the first stars appeared before they reached the livery, and something had shifted between them that both of them knew about and neither of them named. The posting of the lottery results was set for Friday morning at the courthouse board. By 8 o'clock, half of Cimarron had gathered in the street outside. The list would be posted alphabetically by lot number, and next to each number would be the status of the draw, whether the number had been called or not. Mabel stood in the crowd with her heart behaving in a manner she found inconvenient. She was looking for Gideon, and she found him at the edge of the crowd. He was standing with his arms folded and his hat low, and when he saw her, he raised one hand slightly in acknowledgement. She made her way over to him. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terribly," she said, which was the first fully unguarded thing she had said to him. He looked down at her, and there was something soft in his eyes that he did not bother to conceal. "Whatever happens, you'll find a way forward. You're that kind of person." She did not know how to respond to that, so she looked at the courthouse door instead. At 8:30, the territorial clerk came out carrying a large sheet of paper and nailed it to the posting board. The crowd surged forward. It was several minutes of shoving and noise and exclamations before Mabel could get close enough to read the list. She ran her finger down the column of lot numbers. Lot 31. Her breath stopped. Beside lot number 31 in the parcel preference column was written 7148, her first preference. And in the status column beside that, the single word that made the whole world tilt on its axis. Drawn. She had won. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes stung in a way she had not expected, and she did not let the tears fall because she was standing in a crowd of strangers. But they were there, just behind her eyes, the joy and the grief mixed together the way they always are when something you wanted for someone who is gone finally arrives. She turned from the board. She needed air. She made it back to the edge of the crowd before Gideon found her, and he looked at her face and read it in an instant. "You won," he said. "I won," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. He stood very still for a moment, looking at her, and then he did something she did not expect. He smiled fully and genuinely, a smile that had no shadow of envy in it whatsoever, and then he reached out and took her hand and squeezed it once firmly and said, "Congratulations, Miss Gentry, your father would be proud." She pressed her lips together against the sting behind her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. He did not let go of her hand immediately. He held it for one extra beat, the length of a breath, and then released it. They stood there in the thinning crowd, and around them people were cheering or commiserating or walking away in disappointment, and the whole world was in motion except for the small, still space between them. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Will you try the run?" "I'll try for another parcel in the run," he said. "There are good parcels that won't be in the lottery. I'll have a fair shot." "When is it?" 3 weeks out. September 16th officially, though we're already hearing September is when they're set to open it. He had his practical face on again, the working out logistics face she had come to know. "I'll need a good horse. I've been talking to a man about a thoroughbred cross that might have the legs for it." She looked at him for a long moment. The practical thought she had been turning over for 2 days surfaced clearly. "You could work the land with me," she said, "while you're waiting for the run. I'm going to need help breaking ground, and I can pay for labor." He looked at her steadily. "Mabel." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest. "I mean it practically," she said, though she was not entirely certain that was true anymore. "I have the parcel, but I have no means of working it alone in the time before the run. If you helped break the initial ground and we set up a basic camp there, you could prepare for the run while earning wages, and I would have the help I need. It is a practical arrangement." "It is a practical arrangement," he agreed, and his tone said clearly that he knew, as she knew, that it was also something else. "And it's near the parcel you would have chosen in the run," she added, "so you would know the land around it well." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in a way that made the back of her neck warm. Then he said, "All right, I'll help you." The next 3 weeks were the hardest physical work of Mabel's life, and also, in some way she could not fully account for, the happiest. They established a camp on the parcel in the first week, building a simple frame shelter with timber they hauled from the nearest lumber supplier in Cimarron, 8 miles away. It was not much to look at. A single room with a dirt floor and a borrowed canvas over the roof frame until they could afford proper shingles. But it was on her land with its creek and its black soil and its cottonwood trees that whispered at night when the wind came in from the south. Gideon was tireless. He turned sod from before dawn until the light failed, wielding a breaking plow behind a borrowed mule with a steadiness that spoke of genuine physical strength and genuine stubbornness. He showed her how to evaluate soil depth and how to read the creek's behavior from the water marks on the cottonwood roots, determining where the flood line was and how high water came in the worst years. She showed him what she knew about rotation patterns and how her father had managed a Missouri bottomland that was not entirely unlike this one. They taught each other things, and both of them kept a quiet inventory of this, the exchange of knowledge that is one of the most intimate things two people can do. They cooked over an open fire in the evenings, and the Oklahoma nights were enormous, the stars impossibly dense above the flat horizon, and they sat with their coffee cups and talked. They talked about everything, the way people do when they have been alone inside themselves for too long and have suddenly found someone whose company does not exhaust them. They talked about their childhoods, their losses, their beliefs, their small preferences and large philosophies. Gideon had a dry, quiet humor that emerged mostly in understatement, a way of saying the most surprising things in the most matter-of-fact tone that made Mabel laugh in a way that came from somewhere deep and genuine. He was careful with her, not in a way that was condescending or overprotective, but in a way that suggested he had thought about what she might need and was choosing to provide it without making a performance of it. He noticed when she was tired before she said so, and found reasons to rest without making her feel managed. He noticed when something stirred the grief for her father and did not try to fix it, simply sat with her in it, which is the thing people rarely know how to do. She was aware, with increasing clarity, that she was falling in love with him. She observed it the way she might observe the weather changing, with respect for forces larger than herself and a certain understanding that resistance was neither possible nor particularly sensible. She did not tell him. He did not tell her either, but she saw it. She saw it in the way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, in the way he positioned himself between her and any approaching stranger until he had assessed the stranger's intention, in the way he said her name, Mabel, with a particular quality of care that he did not put into other words. The question of the land run sat between them like a ticking clock. He was going to ride on September 16th. Whatever parcel he claimed would determine where he went next. If he claimed something far from here, the arithmetic was bleak. She did not think about the arithmetic. She turned soil and planted seed and taught herself the creek's rhythms and did not think about the arithmetic. 9 days before the run, a man named Cole Hargett rode onto her land. She was at the creek with a bucket when she heard the hoofbeats, and she came up the bank to find a heavy-set man in a good coat on a very fine horse surveying the parcel with proprietary eyes. He looked like money, the kind of money that had come from somewhere else, and was shopping for something to buy. "This is registered land," she said, setting her bucket down. "Lot 7 of Township 14. "I know what it is," the man said pleasantly. He had a broad, ruddy face and eyes that were calculating without being overtly threatening. "Miss Gentry, is it?" "It is. And you are?" "Hargett, Cole Hargett. I have some interests in this territory and I've been looking at this particular parcel." He dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he dismounted. "I'd like to discuss a purchase." "It's not for sale," she said. "Everything is for sale at the right price," he said, in the tone of a man who had found this to be generally true. "Not this," she said. He looked at her assessingly and named a figure. It was a substantial figure, genuinely substantial, enough to buy good farmland in 3 or 4 states without the frontier hardship. She felt the pull of it, the way you feel the pull of any door marked with the word enough. She had 47 cents when she arrived in Cimarron. She was not rich. "No," she said. He named a higher figure. "Mr. Hargett," she said patiently, "you could offer me whatever you have in that coat pocket and I would still tell you no. My answer is not about money." He looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. "Think about it," he said. He produced a card from his vest pocket and held it out to her. "Talk to whoever you need to talk to. I'll be in Cimarron through the end of the week." She took the card because refusing it seemed needlessly combative, but she had no intention of using it. After he rode away, she stood in the afternoon quiet and looked at her land, the creek catching the sun in coins of light, the turned soil dark and rich, the first green shoots of what she had planted beginning to push through. She thought about how it had felt to see her lottery number drawn. She thought about her father. She was putting Cole Hargett's card in the fire that evening when Gideon came back from Cimarron, where he had been arranging the final details of the horse he was renting for the run. He took one look at her face as he swung down from the saddle and said, "What happened?" she told him. She gave him the accurate version without dramatization. He listened with the stillness he brought to things that required careful thinking. "Hargett," he said, "you know him. I know of him. He's been buying up claims all through the Southern Territory, consolidating land for cattle operations, from what I hear. He doesn't farm it himself. He leases it to cattlemen at rates that work out well for Cole Hargett." He paused. "He'll be back." "I know," she said. "He will come back and I will say no again. If he pushes, you need to make clear that you have filed your claim with the land office and your rights are recorded. He can't legally compel you to sell." "I know that too," she said, and he looked at her and she looked back at him, and they were both aware that she knew most of what she needed to know to manage her own affairs. He was telling her partly because he wanted to be useful and partly because what he was actually saying was, "I am thinking about your safety," and that translation was transparent to both of them. "The run is in 9 days," she said. "Yes," he said. "After that you'll have your own land to think about." He was quiet for a long moment, unhitching the horse and walking it to the picket line he had set up near the shelter. She stood there with her arms folded against the evening chill that was dropping in from the north, watching him move with his competent, unhurried grace. "Mabel," he said finally, not turning around. "Yes." He turned then, and his face in the last light of the day was open in a way she had not seen before. The careful, controlled surface of him peeled back to something more unguarded and more true. "I want to talk to you about what comes after the run." Her heart was doing the inconvenient thing again. "All right." He walked back toward her and stopped about 3 feet away, which was close enough that she could see the particular intensity in his dark eyes. The same intensity he brought to the land when he was reading it, turned now entirely on her. "I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I am going to say it plainly because I don't know another way to say it, and I don't think either of us benefits from being indirect." "I appreciate directness," she said, which was perhaps the understatement of her life. "I'm in love with you," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, without decoration and without apology, just the fact of it laid out honestly in the evening air between them. "I know we have known each other less than a month. I know the timing is complicated, with the run, and the land and everything still unsettled. But I'm in love with you and I thought you should know, because whatever I do after the run, I want to do it near you, and I wanted to be honest about why." Mabel stood with the cooling wind coming off the creek, and the stars beginning their nightly appearance above the flat horizon, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been quietly carrying for weeks expand to fill her entire body, warm and certain and unafraid. "I'm in love with you too," she said, "in case you had any uncertainty about that." He let out a long breath that might have been the one he had been holding for days. The corner of his mouth curved. "I had some uncertainty," he said. "You have no reason to be uncertain now," she said. He crossed the remaining distance between them and put his hand along the side of her face, tilting her face up toward him, and she did not look away, and he looked at her for a long moment that said everything they had been saying sideways for weeks, and then he kissed her. It was a careful kiss, his thumb resting against her cheekbone, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart beating there, steady and hard. The kiss was warm and unhurried and tasted of the coffee they had been drinking all afternoon, and when it ended they stood close together in the dark with the creek talking softly below them and the whole enormous Oklahoma sky overhead. "I'm going to find land near here," he said quietly. "Whatever happens in the run." "The Parcel 2 sections east of mine looked promising," she said, equally quietly. "Good water access, slightly higher elevation so the drainage would work well." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "You already researched it. I have been thinking about the arithmetic," she admitted. He smiled, that full warm smile that did something irreversible to her composure. "So have I," he said. The run came on a bright September morning, the 16th of 1893, and Mabel stood on the edge of her land and watched the distant line of riders gather at the boundary markers. She had climbed to the highest point of her property, a low swell of ground to the northeast where she could see for miles. The morning was clear and gold, and the grass was still heavy with dew. She could not make out individual riders at this distance. She watched the line, thick with horses and wagons and people on foot, and then at noon the distant sound of a starting gun reached her across the flat land like a whispered echo, and the line erupted forward in a dark wave that rolled across the prairie toward the waiting parcels. She clasped her hands together and watched, and she did not pray exactly, but she sent something wordless and intent toward wherever Gideon Blackwell was riding in that vast tide of human hope. He came back to her parcel at mid-afternoon. He came riding hard across the grass from the northeast, and she was down at the creek fetching water and heard the hoofbeats and straightened up, and he swung down from the horse before it had fully stopped, which told her something before he said a word. His face was alive with something, flushed with the exertion of the ride and bright with news. "I got it," he said. She set the bucket down. "The parcel east of mine. 2 sections east, just like you said. The soil test I did last week was good. I got there before anyone else reached it, and I planted my stake." He was breathing hard, more from excitement than from fatigue. "It's mine." She crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and he caught her and lifted her, and she laughed into his shoulder, the kind of laugh that is also half a sob because the relief is too large for one emotion to contain. He held her off the ground for a moment and then set her down and held her face in his hands and looked at her as if she were the most important piece of land in the territory. 2 sections east, he said. "Close enough that on a clear day I could walk it in 20 minutes. "Or ride it in 5, she said. "Or ride it in 5, he agreed. "Mabel," he said her name with all the weight he had been putting in it for weeks. "I'm not a man with a great deal to offer. I have a horse and some tools and a piece of raw Oklahoma land that I am going to have to break from scratch, but I intend to build something real on it, something that lasts, and I would very much like to do that next to you." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had given a stranger his lottery spot and helped her work her land without being asked, and told her he loved her plainly and without strategy. She looked at the creek behind her and the dark soil of the field she had been breaking, and she thought about her father saying rich land and clothes enough to walk in 20 minutes. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He kissed her again, this time with less care and more conviction, and the horse tossed its head behind them, and the creek went on talking its steady talk, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a bird was raising an elaborate argument with the afternoon. They were married 6 weeks later in Cimarron, in the small Methodist church that had just been completed on the north end of town and smelled powerfully of fresh lumber. The ceremony was performed by a Reverend James Tolliver, a spare man with kind eyes who married the settlers of the territory at a remarkable clip, because the territory was full of people making new lives, and new lives frequently involved matrimony. Mrs. Parcel, the boarding-house proprietress, attended with a handkerchief already deployed before the service began. Lars Hansen from the general store came, and the woman from the land lottery line, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Edna Hartley, came with her husband, a quiet farmer who shook Gideon's hand with considerable feeling. Senora Castillo, who had somehow become central to Mabel's early days in Cimarron, sent a wedding gift of preserved peppers and sweet corn, and a small jar of honey that Mabel would later regard as the finest wedding gift she had ever heard of. Mabel wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that matched her eyes on a good day, and pinned her hair up with a set of bone combs she had bought at the dry goods store in a moment of deliberate sentimentality. Gideon wore a new blue shirt and his cleaned boots, and looked at her when she walked down the short aisle with an expression that she would spend the rest of her life feeling glad she had seen. After the ceremony, they had a modest celebration at the church with the assembled guests, with a fiddle player who had materialized from somewhere and played reels and slow airs in equal measure. And then they rode home across the dark prairie under the stars that had become familiar to her now, to the land that was, somehow, already beginning to look like something she had always known. The first winter on the parcel was hard, as first winters in raw country always are. The shelter was upgraded before the cold arrived, Gideon working his land 2 sections east during the day and riding to hers in the evenings, to continue the work on her house structure. By November they had proper walls and a real roof, and a wood stove that Mabel had purchased on credit from the Hanson Brothers store, promising it would be paid for by spring. The plank floor went down in November, a luxury she could not quite justify and did not regret at all. Cole Hargett came back once more in October, riding out to the parcel with a final offer that was even more substantial than the previous ones. Mabel told him no with the same pleasant firmness she had used before. He looked at the half-finished house behind her and at Gideon, who had come around the side of the building at the sound of hoofbeats, and was standing with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral, and Hargett seemed to understand that the arithmetic of his situation had changed. He rode away and did not come back. Gideon broke his own land through the fall and into the spring, working with a ferocity that impressed even the neighboring homesteaders who had been doing this work their whole lives. He put in wheat and a kitchen garden, and began planning a small cattle operation to supplement the crop income. Starting with 2 cows he purchased from a settler who was giving up and heading back east. He built his own house with help from 2 neighboring homesteaders in a 2-day raising that was both practical and something of a social occasion, with food shared and stories exchanged, and the kind of neighborly goodwill that is built on the mutual understanding that everyone needs help sometimes, and the currency of that help is returning it when asked. The 2 sections between their parcels became a path worn into the grass by the daily transit of a man who was, by every measure that mattered, happier than he had believed he had any right to be. By the spring of 1894, both operations were beginning to show genuine promise. Mabel's wheat was up and the kitchen garden was producing, and she had added a second milk cow and a flock of chickens whose eggs she sold in Cimarron on the twice-monthly supply trips. Gideon's land was coming along well, the wheat fields expanding as he broke more sod, the small cattle herd growing by careful addition. They talked every evening, either at her house or at his, over supper that one or the other of them had cooked, about the day's work and the land's needs and the small economies and decisions that went into building something from nothing. They were partners in the most complete sense, not just in feeling but in the practical daily reality of it, each relying on the other's knowledge and judgment and labor. And they were deeply, quietly happy. The happiness was not the dramatic kind that announces itself loudly. It was the kind that settles into the bones over time, the happiness of waking each morning to work you believe in beside a person you have chosen and are glad you chose. In the autumn of 1894, Mabel told Gideon she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening at her kitchen table over coffee, with the straightforward approach she brought to most important things. He sat very still for a moment, the coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and then set it down carefully and looked at her. "A child," he said. "In the spring, I think. March or April, from what I can tell." He got up from the table and came around to her and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his, and his face was doing the thing it did when something moved him too deeply for his usual composure to manage. "Mabel," he said. "Don't make me cry," she said. "I have been working very hard not to cry about this all day because there is entirely too much to do this week." "You can cry," he said. "I know I can. I'm choosing not to," but she was gripping his hands quite firmly. He pressed his forehead against her clasped hands for a moment, and when he looked up his eyes were bright. "A child," he said again, as if trying the weight of the word in a new way. A boy or a girl, we won't know which until spring, she said. Though I suppose we ought to start thinking about a larger house. The house, he said immediately, in the tone of a man whose mind had already begun making plans. Not immediately, she said. We have time. But before winter closes in again next year. He was already looking at the walls around them with the critical eye of a builder. She knew that look. She loved that look. She squeezed his hands to bring him back to the present moment, and he looked at her again with that particular expression that she kept in a careful place inside herself. I'm going to build you the best house in the Cherokee Outlet, he said. You are going to build us the best house in the Cherokee Outlet, she corrected. Yes, he agreed. That is what I said. She laughed, and this time she let the tears come too, just briefly, and he held her in the warm kitchen with the wood stove clicking quietly and the October wind moving around the house, and outside the dark prairie waited with all its patient season still ahead. Their son was born in March of 1895, on a cold, clear night when the stars were the kind of sharp you only see in high winter. He arrived with more noise and less ceremony than either of his parents expected, which turned out to be an accurate preview of his personality. The neighboring homesteader's wife, Mrs. Clara Bauer, who had experience in such matters, came to help and was steady and practical and exactly what was needed. Gideon, to his credit, stayed present and useful through the whole of it without doing anything dramatic or inconvenient. When it was done and the baby was in Mabel's arms, she looked at the small red face with its extraordinary weight of perfect fingers and felt the largest and most wordless feeling she had ever had. It overwhelmed grief and joy and love and tiredness all at once, pressing out everything else in the room. Gideon was sitting beside her and she looked up at him, and his face was destroyed in the best possible way, the composure completely gone, just a man looking at his son and his wife with everything he felt written openly across him. What shall we name him? She asked. They had discussed names and had a list, but she wanted to ask again in this moment because it was a different question in this moment. James, Gideon said. James William Blackwell. James for the Reverend who married us, because I have always thought naming something for a kindness is good practice. William for your father. She had not known he was going to say William. She had not known that was what she needed until he said it. James William, she said softly. James William Blackwell opened his eyes at this point, which were the dark brown of his father's, and appeared entirely unimpressed with the proceedings. He looks like you, she said. He has your mouth, Gideon said. God help whoever he argues with when he gets older, she said. Gideon laughed, the full genuine laugh that she had been the primary collector of for the past year and a half, and she leaned her head back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling of the room that was already too small and smiled until her face ached. The new house went up in the summer of 1895, larger and better built than anything either of them had occupied before. Gideon designed it himself, with input from Mabel that fundamentally altered 4 of his original choices, and he was honest enough to acknowledge that all 4 of her changes were improvements. There was a proper kitchen with a cook stove and a worktable long enough to actually be useful. There were 2 bedrooms with the understanding that a 3rd would be added within a few years. There was a covered porch facing south that caught the afternoon light and sheltered it from the worst of the Oklahoma wind, and it had 2 chairs on it because Mabel had specified 2 chairs, saying there was no point in a porch if 2 people could not sit on it together. The porch became, over the years, one of the most important places in their lives. They sat on it in the mornings before the day's work began, coffee in hand, watching James toddle across the yard chasing the chickens with a single-minded intensity that suggested he had inherited both parents' stubbornness in full measure. They sat on it in the evenings after supper, watching the Oklahoma sky do its extravagant things with color, talking about the day and the plans and the small pleasures and difficulties that made up a life. They sat on it on Sunday afternoons sometimes and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of conversation. Gideon's land 2 sections east continued to grow. By 1896, his wheat operation was producing enough surplus to make a real profit after expenses, and he had expanded the cattle to a small but healthy herd of 15 animals. He hired a hand part-time, a young Tejano man named Tomás who was 16, and had shown up at the fence one day looking for work, with a kind of quiet desperation that Gideon had recognized. Tomás turned out to be an exceptionally capable hand with cattle and a quick learner about crops besides, and by the following year he was working full-time and saving money, with the focused intensity of someone who has a clear picture of where they are going. The territory was changing around them. The land run of 1893 had filled the Oklahoma Territory with tens of thousands of settlers in a matter of months, and towns were growing, roads being graded, post offices established, the whole infrastructure of civilization assembling itself with remarkable speed. Cimarron became a proper town with a school and a bank and 2 competing newspapers, and a level of commerce that would have been unrecognizable to the muddy chaos of 1893. Not all of the change was easy or just. Mabel watched with troubled eyes as the legal machinery of territorial settlement continued to compress the lives of the native people whose land this had originally been. The Cherokee Outlet had been purchased by the government from the Cherokee Nation in 1891, a transaction that the Cherokee had conducted under conditions that the word negotiation did not honestly describe. She heard stories from other settlers about the Osage people and the conflicts over land and rights that were taking place to the east. She talked about this with Gideon on the porch in the evenings, and he listened and did not make it smaller than it was. "We are sitting on land that was not always ours to take," she said once, in the particular blunt way she had with uncomfortable truths. "That's true," he said. "I don't know what to do with that." "I don't either," he said. "Not fully. But I think the beginning of doing something with it is not pretending it's otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. "And treating people as people wherever you meet them. It won't fix what's already been done, but it's not nothing." They were not people who could change the large machinery of government policy, but they were people who could conduct their corner of the world with integrity, and that was what they did. When a family of mixed Cherokee and white heritage settled 2 miles to the north, Mabel brought a welcome gift and spent an afternoon in their kitchen, and came home having made a friend in the wife, a woman named Mary Sixkiller, who turned out to be one of the finest gardeners in the territory, and became an enduring presence in their lives. The years moved through them with the particular speed and texture that happy years have, fast in the living and rich in the memory. James grew from a red-faced infant into a sturdy toddler with opinions, and then into a sharp-eyed boy of 4 who was already following his father through the wheat fields with a miniature seriousness that made both his parents press their lips together to keep from laughing. Mabel's Parcel continued to produce. She had become known in the local agricultural community for her kitchen garden, which she ran with a scientific rigor that would not have been out of place in a university, keeping detailed records of what she planted where and when and what the yields were, comparing from year to year, adjusting her methods. She corresponded with the new Oklahoma Agricultural Extension Office that had been established in Guthrie and exchanged notes with other female homesteaders across the territory, in a loose network of practical knowledge sharing that made a material difference to everyone involved. She also, in the spring of 1897, told Gideon she was expecting a second child. He took this news with the same quality of stillness that he had brought to most of the most important moments of their marriage, and then he kissed her in the middle of the kitchen with such thoroughness that James, who was 2 and watching from the doorway with a chicken biscuit in his hand, made a noise of profound complaint. Their second child, a daughter named Clara Rose Blackwell, arrived in November of 1897. She was born in the new house on a mild night that was unseasonable for late autumn, and she arrived with considerably more efficiency than her brother had, as if she had considered the project and decided to have it done with. Clara Rose had Mabel's gray-green eyes and her father's dark hair, and from her very first week of life, a manner that suggested she had given the situation due consideration and found it acceptable. James, at 2.5, received his sister with the complex mixture of curiosity and suspicion that characterizes older siblings the world over. But by the end of the first week, he had assigned himself the role of her protector with a seriousness that was both touching and slightly alarming, given his own limited competence at the time. "He has opinions about everything," Mabel said one evening, watching James explaining something at length to his infant sister, who regarded him with apparent attention. "He comes by it honestly," Gideon said, with perfect innocence. She gave him a look. "I beg your pardon. I only mean that he is the product of two people with opinions." "And which of those two people talks less?" "I talked plenty in those first weeks in Cimarron," he said. "You have a short memory." "I have a precise memory," she said. "Which is the opposite of short." He grinned at her across the kitchen, and she felt the warmth that had not dimmed in 4 years, if anything more present and more certain than it had been on the September night they stood in the dark with the creek talking below them and said the truest things they knew to each other. By 1898, Gideon had formalized something he had been considering for 2 years. He proposed to Mabel that they consolidate the 2 parcels under a single operation, managing both as one farm with a focused rotation system that would make the most of the combined acreage. She had been thinking the same thing and had her own detailed proposal ready, which she produced from the kitchen drawer. They spread both proposals on the kitchen table and compared them line by line and argued about 3 points of difference with the enthusiasm that people who respect each other's thinking bring to disagreement. By the end of the evening, they had a plan that incorporated the best elements of both, which was entirely how they had expected it to go. Tamaz, now 19 and thoroughly experienced, became the 3rd full-time member of the operation, managing the cattle herd as his primary responsibility with a competence and pride that was entirely earned. He had found himself a girl in Cimarron, a Tejana woman named Rosaria who worked at Senora Castillo's establishment, and had opinions about Tamaz's hat that she expressed without reservation. Mabel liked her immediately. The consolidated operation was named Blackwell Farm in the formal records, but was referred to locally as the Gentry Blackwell Place by the people who had watched it grow, a dual acknowledgement that both Gentry and Blackwell had made it what it was, and which suited Mabel more than she made a point of saying. Life was not without its difficulties. There was a drought in the summer of 1899 that scorched half the wheat and required the use of savings that both of them had been carefully building. There was a hard winter in 1900 that tested the cattle herd and took 3 animals despite everything they could do. There was a period in the fall of 1898 when Gideon came down with a fever that lasted 10 terrible days and made Mabel understand, with a clarity she had not needed before, exactly how much of her own heart was walking around outside her body in the form of this particular man. She nursed him with the same systematic attention she brought to everything and sat beside his bed through the nights when the fever was at its worst, and when it broke and his eyes came back to her clear and fully present, she gripped his hand under the blanket and did not tell him she had been afraid because there was no need. He already knew. She already knew that he knew. This was the nature of knowing someone well. By the time Clara Rose was walking and James was 5 and starting at the small school that had been established in the converted barn of a homesteader 4 miles east, the Blackwell farm was a genuine enterprise. The wheat was consistent, and the kitchen garden surplus went to market. The cattle herd numbered 40, which was a respectable size for a family operation. The house had gotten its 3rd bedroom, added in 1899 in advance of Clara Rose's independence from the shared nursery, and the porch chairs had been supplemented with a swing that James had requested and that turned out to be used most frequently by the adults. Mrs. Parcel, the Cimarron boarding housekeeper, came to visit in the summer of 1899 and sat on that porch and drank lemonade and surveyed the whole operation with the satisfaction of someone who had watched something begin. "I knew when you came through that door in 1893 with that carpetbag and that chin," she said to Mabel, "that you were not a woman who was going to let this territory get the better of her." "It tried," Mabel said. "Everything worth having does," Mrs. Purcell said, and looked pointedly at Gideon, who was coming across the yard from the barn with James on his shoulders, the boy laughing at some altitude-based joke his father had made. Gideon ducked under the porch beam with practiced ease and set James down on the porch and looked at Mabel with the particular look he had, the one that was just slightly too warm to be described as ordinary marital regard. "I didn't try very hard," he said, which was a reference to some private conversation between them, and Mabel laughed and Mrs. Purcell pretended not to notice any of it. The Oklahoma Territory became the state of Oklahoma in November of 1907, a development that had been anticipated for years and that occasioned celebrations across the territory with a fervor proportional to how long everyone had been waiting for it. Mabel and Gideon rode into Cimarron for the statehood celebration with James, now 12 and beginning to look like his father in the jaw and forehead, and Clara Rose, 9 and possessed of a social confidence that still surprised her parents, and they watched the speeches and the fireworks and the general communal joy with the pleasure of people who have invested themselves in a place and feel its milestones as their own. "Oklahoma," Gideon said, watching the fireworks burst over the town, with Clara Rose asleep against his shoulder and James pretending he had not been asleep 30 seconds ago. "State number 46, Mabel said. 46, he confirmed. He looked at her sidelong with the particular warmth that still, after 14 years, did the irreversible thing to her composure. "Do you remember what you told me, that first morning at the land office?" "I told you several things at the land office," she said. "You said your father used to speak of Oklahoma like some men speak of heaven." She had forgotten she had said that to him. She thought about her father, the way she still did on days of significance, with a tenderness that time had softened from grief into something more like gratitude that she had known him at all. "He was right," she said. "He was entirely right." Gideon put his free arm around her shoulders and she leaned into the warmth of him, and the fireworks continued their extravagant commentary on the night, and James, despite his best efforts, fell back asleep against his mother's arm. There was a third child, eventually. They had not planned for it with precision, but they were not surprised. In the autumn of 1908, when James was 13 and Clara Rose was 10, and the farm was in the most settled and productive phase it had yet seen, Mabel told Gideon with the same kitchen table directness that she was expecting again in the spring. He looked at her across the table with those dark eyes that still held everything she had ever needed to find in a person's face and said, "A third Blackwell." "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Mabel," he said, and the way he said her name was still exactly what it had always been, careful and certain and entirely particular to her. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas Edward Blackwell, Thomas for Tamaz, who was by now almost family in every sense that mattered, and Edward for Gideon's older brother who had taken the Texas ranch, and with whom Gideon had maintained a careful and genuine affection despite the complications, arrived in April of 1909. He had Mabel's auburn hair and a placid temperament that distinguished him from both his older siblings and made him, from an early age, the most restful presence in a house that had never been particularly quiet. James, now 14, received his brother with a teenage boy's complex mixture of delight and dignity. Clara Rose, who was 11 and had definitive opinions about nearly everything, decided within the first week that Thomas was her personal project and undertook his development with a focused attention that made Mabel feel both grateful and faintly concerned. The farm grew. The years grew. The life they had built on the land that a lottery had given her, on the land that Gideon Blackwell had reached by riding hard across the Oklahoma grass on a September morning, deepened and expanded, and rooted itself so thoroughly into both of them that it became impossible to say where the land ended and they began. They were, by the standards of their neighbors and by their own honest assessment, prosperous. Not wealthy in the way that men like Cole Hargett were wealthy, with money made by leverage and volume and distance from the actual earth. Prosperous in the way that means you have built something real, and it sustains you, and you are not afraid. The farm fed them, and housed them, and educated their children, and put enough aside each year to give them the security that Gideon had dreamed of in his years of riding other men's land, the security of something that was theirs and could not be taken from them. James, at 17, had his father's hands and his mother's eye for soil quality, and he had already begun to have opinions about the crop rotation schedule that were worth listening to. He was going to be a farmer, they both knew it, though they had been careful not to say so as if it were settled, wanting him to arrive at it himself. He arrived at it on his own one evening when he was 16, coming in from the north field with mud to his knees and a look of complete satisfaction on his face, and saying matter-of-factly that he supposed he would be staying on the farm because there was nowhere else he actually wanted to be. Mabel had looked at Gideon across the supper table when James said this, and Gideon had looked back at her with the quiet pleasure of two people who have made something good together. Clara Rose, as it turned out, was going to be a teacher. She announced this at 13 with the characteristic decisiveness she brought to all important decisions, and spent the next years pursuing the education required for it with an efficiency that made her parents proud and her brothers vaguely beleaguered. She attended the normal school in Guthrie and came back with a teaching certificate and a young man she had met there who was a schoolteacher himself, a quietly intelligent person named Arthur Denning, whom Clara Rose had apparently evaluated and approved of with the same methodical approach she brought to everything. Mabel liked him very much. Gideon liked him well enough and watched him the way fathers watch young men who have designs on their daughters, with an attention that was not unfriendly but was entirely thorough. Arthur Denning passed whatever examination Gideon was administering without knowing it was happening, and he and Clara Rose were married in the summer of 1917, in the church in Cimarron that was no longer new and no longer smelled of fresh lumber, but had a settled warmth about it that suited the occasion. Mabel cried at the wedding with complete abandon, which surprised nobody, and Gideon kept his composure until Clara Rose hugged him before the first dance and said, "Papa," against his shoulder in a particular small voice that was unchanged from childhood, and then he did not keep his composure any more. Thomas, their youngest, grew into his placid temperament without apology and became, as peaceful people often do, the most generally beloved member of any gathering he joined. He had a gift for animals that exceeded even Gideon's considerable competence with cattle and horses, and by the time he was 18, he had taken over the primary management of the herd, with a thoughtfulness and skill that made Thomas, now with his own small spread to the south, declare with great satisfaction that he had trained the boy well. The farm passed naturally into the next generation, James running the crop operation with increasing authority as the years settled Gideon into a role that was more advisory and less physically demanding, not because he had lost the capacity, but because James had clearly grown into it, and it was time. Mabel supervised the kitchen garden and the household accounts with the meticulous precision she had always brought to them, and spent some portion of every afternoon on the south-facing porch with a cup of coffee and a notebook in which she kept the records she had kept for 30 years. And Gideon sat beside her. That was the constant. Through the droughts and the good years and the children growing and the changing of the territory and the becoming of the state and all the large and small revisions that a life accumulates, he sat beside her on the porch they had built together and watched the Oklahoma sky do its extravagant things with color. And they talked or did not talk, and the particular ease that had grown between them from the first days in that raw prairie camp was unchanged in its essential nature if not in its expression. It was the ease of two people who had chosen each other with full information and had found, again and again, that the choice was the right one. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, in the autumn of 1918, they sat on the porch after a supper that Clara Rose, home for a visit with Arthur and their own small son, had cooked with serious attention to all the dishes that had mattered most over the years. James had eaten enough for two men and gone out to do the evening check on the cattle with Thomas, their voices carrying back from the barn in the dusk. Arthur was inside reading, which was what Arthur did most evenings, and which everyone had come to appreciate as a reliable and peaceful constant. The sky was doing its October thing, the deep clear blue of the last good days before winter, going orange at the horizon, and then a violet that made Mabel think, as she often did, that the people who said Oklahoma was not beautiful had been looking the wrong direction. Gideon was quiet beside her, his coffee cup in both hands, looking at the western sky. He had lines around his eyes now that were not there in 1893, and his dark hair had gone salt and pepper in his 40s, and he was 53 years old with 30 years of Oklahoma weather in his face, and she had never in her life looked at him without the particular feeling she had first noticed on a dusty Cimarron street when he gave a stranger his lottery slip and walked back to his place in line as if he had done nothing of consequence. 25 years, he said. 25 years, she agreed. He looked at her. I was thinking about the first day, the land office line. So was I, she said. I couldn't have known, standing in that line thinking about a lottery slip, that I was going to end up sitting on this porch. Life is not particularly transparent in advance, she said. No, he agreed, but I have thought many times that it worked out better than I would have known to plan. He paused. You won the parcel I wanted and I ended up with something better. She looked at him. The parcel 2 sections east. No, he said simply. I mean I ended up with you. He said it the way he said everything important, plainly and without decoration, just the fact of it in the evening air. Whatever I thought I was trying to build when I got in that line in Cimarron, what I actually built was better, because of you. She looked at the horizon for a moment because the feeling in her chest was very large, and she needed somewhere to put her eyes while she organized herself. The sky went from orange to violet to the first deep blue of evening, and the first star appeared above the tree line to the east, and from the barn she could hear James laughing at something Thomas had said. You built it with me, she said. Not because of me, with me. He considered this for a moment, turning it over in the careful, honest way he turned over things that mattered. Yes, he said. That's more accurate. She put her hand over his on the armrest of his chair, covering his fingers with hers. His hand turned under hers and held on. They sat like that in the evening, not needing to say anything more about it, because some truths are large enough that they become the air you breathe rather than the words you speak. The farm would go on after them. They both knew that. James had his father's hands and his mother's eye and 30 good years in him to build with. Clara Rose would teach another generation to read and think and reach for something. Thomas would raise cattle with the quiet authority of a person who knows animals at the bone level. There were grandchildren already, and there would be more, each one arriving into a family that had been built from the particular raw materials of an Oklahoma lottery slip and a borrowed horse, and 2 people standing on a rise above a creek in the September light saying this. This is what we want. Mabel Gentry Blackwell sat on her porch in the dusk of her 25th anniversary and held her husband's hand and looked at the land that had been her father's dream and then her own dream, and then the foundation of something she could not have dreamed alone, and felt the fullness of it in every part of herself. The farm stretching away into the blue evening. The creek talking its steady talk down in the cottonwoods. The barn with the light in the window and her sons moving inside it. The smell of wood smoke coming from the kitchen where her daughter was washing up with a song she half remembered. "I'm glad you were in that line," she said. Gideon Blackwell squeezed her hand. "Best line I ever stood in," he said. The last light left the sky. The stars came out in their fullness, the same stars that had been above them on the first night they sat beside the fire on this land and started to understand what they were to each other. The porch swing hung still in the windless evening. An owl called from the cottonwoods, distant and melodic and entirely at home. Inside the house, Clara Rose stopped singing and someone laughed, a warm sound that reached the porch and settled around the two people sitting there like a blanket pulled close against the autumn chill. Gideon turned up the collar of his coat with his free hand. Mabel leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out and the evening had deepened to night, and neither of them was in any hurry to go inside, because there was nothing waiting for them out in the world that was better than exactly where they were.